Hi, good morning. I should say, yeah, good morning from Tucson, Arizona. And I'm here with a very distinguished neuroscientist from England, Anil Seth. We'll talk more about him in a moment. But I just want to say that today, April 6th, is the second anniversary of Facebook Live and also my career here with all of you and with the support of Facebook. Second anniversary as an influencer. I want to take a moment to thank Sheryl Sandberg and also Shannon Mattingly and Camilla Gray for the amazing support here on Facebook. Thank you all also for joining me here. I also want to say that this activity with you is my favorite activity because, as you know, I'm obsessed with consciousness, and I always like to highlight people who are exploring consciousness in one way or another, either through science, particularly brain science, or through philosophy, or through self-inquiry and contemplative techniques that go back thousands of years. So thank you. And thank you, Sheryl, and thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Camilla. Great to have you.
Thank you, Deepak. It's a pleasure. And I can't remember a previous discussion where my last name, Seth, has been pronounced properly.
Yes,
of course.
Yes,
Indian family.
That's right. But tell us a little bit about your current position is in England and in Surrey, right?
It's Sussex, actually.
In Sussex,
often
yeah.
easily confused.
Okay,
So I'm a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience there at the University of Sussex, which is near Brighton on the south coast of England. And there I am also co-director of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science, which is a research group. My co-director is the chair of psychiatry, Hugo Critchley, there. We've been working now for about 9 years within a very multidisciplinary environment, and we have physicists, mathematicians, psychologists, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, a whole range of people, philosophers, of course, all trying to understand trying to follow an empirical approach to understanding the biology of consciousness, the physics of consciousness, but also, and I think equally importantly, to translate the insights from such a science into improved treatments for psychiatric and neurological conditions.
So we have a lot to talk about because what is the practical application of consciousness science? Where did you go to school?
Well, I grew up I've already said I'm half Indian, but I grew up entirely in South England, near Oxford, and as with many kids, I think, when I was a teenager, I was just fascinated by this mystery of consciousness. It just seemed, how can this be understood? It didn't seem to fit with any of the disciplines I was being taught at school, but it's the kind of thing that everybody talks about. And so I went to, my undergraduate degree was at Cambridge, where I studied natural sciences. Started out in physics because, like many people, I thought, well, physics can explain everything.
Ultimate reality.
We're going to do it. Veered into psychology by the end of that, experimental psychology as a more direct route to the brain and issues of consciousness. And then after Cambridge, which was a wonderful education, I was very lucky to be taught there, I went to Sussex for the first time for a master's and a PhD in computer science and artificial intelligence.
I see. And
when that finished in about 2001, I moved to the US and spent 6-7 years in San Diego, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and of course where you're based too. And I worked there as a postdoctoral researcher for Gerald Edelman, who was one of these guys, Nobel Prize winner, but one of the main figures in bringing consciousness science back within the remit of neuroscience, because up until then, wherever I'd been, the idea of studying consciousness scientifically had still been, at least in my experience, quite fringe and not really done in the places I'd been. So San Diego was a fantastic experience with Edelman, but also Christoph Koch and Francis Crick
Sure.
at the Salk across the road.
Mm-hmm.
And then about 10 years ago, just over, I moved back to Sussex to start up my own lab there, and I've been there ever since.
Okay, so now that we have a little bit of background with Anil, and I would like to just start with a very basic question. How do you, as a neuroscientist, define consciousness?
I like to go back to the definition of Tom Nagel, the philosopher. For consciousness, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism or that system. There is the presence of a phenomenal scene of colours, shapes, smells, thoughts, beliefs, any kind of conscious experience. There's a continuous stream of such phenomenal content that is interruptible, though usually continuous. But really at heart, I think we all know what consciousness is. It is the presence of any kind of experience at all.
Mm-hmm.
There is something it is like to be that system. This is a pretty vague definition, if you like. But sometimes I think people put a bit too much emphasis, certainly in sciences, on the need for a very, very formal definition at the outset.
Mm-hmm.
Now I think history of science shows pretty well also that definitions evolve along with the
Sure.
study. We've seen this with definitions of the gene and so on. So having a good definition really is more useful just to make sure that we don't end up talking about different things.
Different things.
Yeah.
So right now we're having an experience,
I think
you and I,
definitely.
and we're sharing it with thousands
Lots
of
of
people,
people.
lots of people.
Yeah.
Where exactly is this experience happening?
Well, that's a good question. Is it something that has a location?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. There are some answers to this which I think would be definitely wrong. The idea that experience is happening in a particular location in the brain, or in a particular class of neurons in the brain. Everything in science is provisional, and it's all riven with doubt. It's just an evolving system of doubt. But the working assumption for me is that the necessary and sufficient substrate for any kind of experience is the brain. So that when the brain is in a particular state, there will be a particular conscious experience. For certain kinds of experiences to happen, there have to be things outside the brain, outside the skull, outside the body. I couldn't be having this particular experience without you also existing, without this place in Arizona existing, and without my body being a very important part. And I think in my work this is a key part of it, actually, the appreciation of the relevance of the body for shaping our conscious experiences. Mm-hmm. But it still comes back to without the brain, at least I think, there would not be conscious experiences.
Okay, so we'll explore that in a moment. But you mentioned Thomas Nagel. His last book was very critically attacked by the lay press. I don't know if you
I actually
saw that.
didn't know it. I met Tom Nagel. I was really privileged to meet him a couple of years ago in a meeting in Sweden. Still smoking cigars. Very fantastic guy. But I must confess I didn't read the latest book.
Anyway, I tried to get in touch with him, but he doesn't. These days, he doesn't. He's not public anymore.
Right. So
let me go over a few other takes on consciousness. See if you agree on them or not. So, most people would agree with the definition you have, and it's pretty good, I would say. But would you also agree with the following definitions? Consciousness is the knowing element in every experience.
Not necessarily. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. Of course, it depends what you mean by knowing in this case. There's an essential aspect of a conscious experience that it is immediately present to the experiencing an organism, and through conscious experiences we know things. I think there's no other way to know things apart from through conscious experiences.
Would you then agree with the next statement I was going to make? Consciousness is that in which all experience occurs, all experience is known, and the third part, out of which all experience is made.
Are they just different? The way I understand that, it's kind of, you're just saying that there's a synonym for consciousness and experience.
Yes.
And in that sense, I agree that consciousness is the sum total of experiences that we have. At any one time, our conscious condition is the content of our experience. And an important part of that experience is the experience of knowing things. I know about you, about something about what you think now, and I know something about what's in this room through my experience. But I also know any scientific knowledge is also ultimately founded in experience.
In the experience.
Yeah.
What about the fact that there are biological organisms that have experiences that don't have a brain? I mean, does a paramecium have an experience? Or a plant have an experience? Or what in Eastern wisdom traditions are referred to as sentient beings, any biological organism, is it not having some kind of experience? Or are we right now only defining consciousness in terms of human experience?
Right, this is a really good question. I think it's a really important topic. And there's a couple of things to say about it. One is that in many Western traditions of thinking about consciousness, there's been an unfortunate, what we might call, tendency to anthropocentrism or human exceptionalism. You know, we define things that are valuable in as much as they resemble us, and in as much as we think we're special, different, and apart from the rest of the universe. So you can see this in consciousness in some lines of thinking that associated it with complex thought and language, which I think is now, and I always did think, it's a rather ridiculous thing to say, because you end up denying consciousness not only to other species, but also to newborn infants.
That's right.
And people wouldn't actually want to do that, and I don't think there's any grounds to do that. Just because you can't, a newborn infant can't engage in detailed philosophical argument doesn't mean they're not the subject of experiences. So I personally think that a good theory of consciousness should not
Exclude.
should not exclude, and it should not be motivated by what we think as being distinctively human or distinctively special, something that sets us apart from the universe. So, and just another thing on that, there's nowadays, maybe it's not language, but intelligence is playing the same role. We tend to think that, and you see this in the debate about artificial intelligence, as things get smarter and smarter, maybe they'll become aware or self-aware. I actually think that much more important is the fact that we are living. Now, every conscious system that we know of, or even if we might disagree about how far to extend the magic circle, they're all alive. Every conscious system that we know of, we might speculate as being conscious, is alive. But there are plenty of intelligent systems already, at least intelligent in some way, that are not conscious. My phone here is pretty smart, but I'm still not worried about its inner feelings. Whether I should be or not, different question. But
do you think there's a possibility that this will ultimately have inner feelings?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Some people would disagree, but I think one of the things that, and we're diverting a little bit, but that's fine if that's
okay.
all right with you, that artificial intelligence systems at the moment, they are not living systems. They did not evolve over millennia to care about their own persistence over time. If we think about what the most fundamental experiences that we have, what are they? They are things like experiences of suffering, of pain, of pleasure, of reward, of fear, basic emotional states that signal the viability of the current situation for future survival. This, I think, is fundamental. And how do we understand the provenance of these basic conscious states? Well, it's through the body. The brain cares about staying alive. It cares about keeping the body alive. And we almost went on a journey there.
That's fine.
Let's try now. We're a bit tilted, aren't we?
We are a bit tilted.
Yeah,
we can adjust this. and that's all right.
I think that was the computer's way of telling me to stick to the point.
Yeah, that's all right.
But just to get back to your
Yeah.
specific question now,
Mm-hmm.
based on the fact that even humans can lose consciousness at times,
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's had general anesthesia
Sure.
is aware
Conscious
of
experience
this.
is gone.
It goes.
Yeah, go.
So this gives me the reason to suspect that not everything that is alive necessarily has a conscious experience. Of course, not all conscious experiences have to be like human conscious experiences. What are the minimal sufficient conditions? I don't think we know, but I think some kind of nervous system that is involved in preservation of maintenance of the body over time is probably necessary. And there's a story to be told there about how perception happens.
Okay, we have an entire hour for this conversation. I'm going to keep adjusting the
We'll find it.
yeah, we'll
A
find
better
it.
way to do it is less
But that's
reliant on a
good.
bowl.
But that's good.
Yeah.
So let me share one more definition of consciousness
Sure.
that comes from Eastern traditions, and then we'll move on because we have a lot to discuss, including about the brain. But in many of the Eastern traditions, consciousness is the potential for experience in every species of consciousness and every potential for knowing in every species of consciousness. And that is different in different species,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So this is a human experience that you're having.
Yeah.
And as we look at the brain now, with all that we're learning about the microbiome, the autonomic nervous system, is the brain just here, or is this whole thing
Yeah,
the brain?
I think there's a lot more to the story than just the neurons that happen to be inside your head.
Yeah.
I think those are it's still. I mean, we both know there's an enormous amount we don't understand about the brain in the skull, but I've been very, very impressed and very excited by all the recent developments in understanding bodily influences. So we have we have neurons throughout the body. We have plenty in our gut. That are very highly dependent on levels of particular neurotransmitters like serotonin.
I believe 90% of this serotonin is coming from the gut.
I don't know the figure, but I wouldn't be surprised.
It's
It's a high number,
Yeah.
and so there are all interesting questions there about the effects of antidepressant pills on your on your gut, and emerging work on this microbiome. So the idea that we all have the number of cells that are actually part of our body, i.e. that have our inherited DNA, and is far outnumbered by the number of microbial cells that live
That's right.
in
fact,
inside us.
99% of our genetic information in the body is microbial.
Right, so again, this is a fascinating emerging picture of modern biology that is just blurring all these distinctions that we at one point thought of as to be taken for granted, that there is a distinction between my brain, my body, and the world. I don't think that really holds up. And I don't think it holds up in a very rigorous empirical scientific
Are we
point of
the
view.
awakening of bacterial consciousness?
Well, I think, I still don't think a bacterium is conscious. Why do I not think this? Well, it's just because the work I've been doing has been focusing still on the single most accessible case where we know conscious experiences happens, which is a human brain. And the mechanisms that we see that are necessary in human or primate brains, we don't see any kind of analogy or homology in bacteria. But that's not to say that the bacterial life within us and among us is not a profound influence on our awareness. I'm sure it
It's
is.
producing most of the serotonin, influencing our moods.
Right, and I think, I was talking just the other day, I was in Canada, where they have a very high-profile microbiome project, and the possibilities of even developing new therapies for psychiatric conditions based on the microbiome. That's still very, very early days, but it's part of this general idea, I think, where we can look for novel bodily-based, brain-based causes of psychiatric problems. there's a lot of stuff that some mental health issues are to do with inflammation problems or immune problems, and then the microbiome is very, very implicated in the correct functioning of our immune system. So, yeah, I think it's both empirically interesting, but also philosophically interesting, because it again reveals that there are these strong connections between life and between mind and between awareness that we might share with plenty of other species. So, yeah, other minds too. Yeah, we're having a particular kind of human experience now. I once spent a week in Italy with a bunch of octopuses, and very different brains. I mean, still made of neurons and have a lot of them and so on. But the feeling that you were in the presence of a sentient organism was just, yeah, I mean, it was overpowering. Not empirical, but it was overpowering. And then you think, well, if they are sentient, and I certainly feel they would be, the region of the space of possible minds, of possible consciousnesses that an octopus is inhabiting is so very different from our own. Our body's a relatively fixed thing in the world. We can move it around, but it doesn't change shape or colour or texture. An octopus body does all of these things and more. So the experience of what is our body for an octopus would be entirely different from something that we just carry along with us, almost taking it for granted.
So here's a question based on just what you said. You've gotten a lot of publicity recently for you watch your TED Talk
Thank you.
on the world being a controlled hallucination produced by the brain. But before I get to that, is our body the container of experience, or is our body an experience in consciousness?
I think it's certainly an experience in consciousness, and I think it's also a very important influence on our experiences, not just of the body itself, but of the world too. I really think that an understanding of the body and it's critical for an understanding of human consciousness, and of course there is a lot of resonance with Eastern wisdom on this, on understanding the relevance of the body and the state of the body for its effects on our conscious minds.
Explain to our audience, and once again, just to remind you, I'm with Anil Seth. He's a professor of neuroscience, runs an amazing research program in England, and he's been recently getting a lot of attention for his work, and you can check him out on his website, and you can come back to this conversation if you just joined, but thank you for being here. Anil, explain why you said this, that the world is a controlled hallucination. The world we experience is a controlled hallucination produced by the brain.
Yeah.
For those who haven't had access to your talks.
Hi, yes. Actually, there's... I'll try to explain it very quickly now, but the TED Talk, which was from last year...
Which we can link to, by the way.
Yeah, it's probably... Because I rehearsed that one a lot, so that's...
It's a lot to say in 18 minutes.
But the basic idea, and so there's... Let me first say what I'm not saying by this. And I think... I think the word hallucination has a very strong set of connotations. So what I'm not saying is that we're just making everything up and there is no such thing as a real world. I mean, I've had plenty of comments of things like, well, if you think the world is a hallucination, come and stand in front of a train and see if that's still a hallucination.
The train and the body.
Well, exactly. I mean, and
could both be.
They could. I'm sure we'll get to that. The more metaphysics of it. But what I mean is actually something much less controversial. I think it's still counterintuitive to many people. And the idea is that we tend to think the way we perceive the world is a sort of direct reflection of an external reality. I mean, that's the way our brains and minds seem to have been built, that if you don't reflect on it very much, or if you don't do the neuroscience of it, you walk around and you think, yeah, that table is green, that chair has this particular shape and is a red chair. If I'm walking down the street, I'm seeing lots of people, and suddenly I see someone who looks like my friend. I see them, I see my friend as being there. We tend to attribute the contents of our experiences to things in the world as having those properties. It's a red chair, it's a round mug. But of course,
does that fall under the phrase naive realism?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think yes, exactly.
Okay.
So we bring this psychological naive realism to our experiences of the world and to the body too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's even more deeply embedded in our psyche, is that, I'm me. Don't need to explain that. I exist. But of course, from the brain's point of view, all the brain gets are noisy and ambiguous electrical signals that originate from somewhere, from whatever we say is out there in the
Whatever
world.
experience, there's an action potential going to the brain.
There's
right?
action potential going. And perception, at least to a first approximation, is about making sense of these signals and figuring out the causes of these sensory signals. And this is a very old idea, but I usually trace it to a German physiologist called Hermann von Helmholtz, who developed a theory of perception as inference. And so what he said was, yes, okay, there are all these noisy, ambiguous sensory signals. They don't come labelled with things like I am light, I'm red, this is from a mug. They're just electrical signals. So in order to make sense of them, the brain has to bring to bear some prior expectations or best guesses about the way the world is, and then combine these prior expectations with the sensory data to come up with its best guess of the causes of these sensory signals. And that's what that's what we consciously perceive. It's the brain's best guess of what's out there. And there's some pretty normal everyday examples of them. Lots of visual illusions work on this basis by messing around or exploiting some of the brain's prior expectations. By the way, we don't have to be conscious that we have these prior expectations. They're just wired in through evolution and development. We're so used to seeing light coming from above, because all our ancestors experienced light as coming from the sky, that we will interpret shadows in this way, even though the actual pattern of light and shade for a shadow is often ambiguous. There are many examples where we can see this happening. Another one, if you walk out and it's a foggy day and you're expecting to see a friend, but you see someone and you think, oh, that's him, and then it turns out to be someone else as you get up close. That's another example of your expectation about what's out there shifting your perception. And the implication of this is that instead of this naive realism where there's an external world with properties like colour and whatnot that are transduced somehow into action potentials in the brain and then recreate this inner world with the same properties in the head, no, it is not like that at all. We actively generate the conscious worlds that we live in. What we consciously perceive is the content of the brain's predictions, which flow not from the outside in, but from the inside out. We actively perceive our worlds. All the sensory data that's coming in, that's not telling us directly what's there. That's just always refining the difference between the brain's predictions and what's out there in the world.
That's a human experience anyway, right? It's a human experience anyway. It's a species-specific experience.
Yeah, it is, but it's probably a general principle. And the reason I call this a controlled hallucination, and by the way, I didn't make up that. It's a beautiful phrase, and I heard it from Chris Frith, a British psychologist, who heard it from someone else, and we don't know where it started. But San Diego apparently actually was first coined there. But the reason that we use this term is the idea that all perception is this balance between what we expect and what we get. And if you tweak that balance one way or the other, then your perceptions will start to diverge. Mm-hmm. So people that in everyday language we would say are hallucinating, they're seeing things the rest of us aren't seeing, well, maybe that's because their perceptual predictions are not being sufficiently controlled or reined in by sensory data. Mm-hmm. So that's why, if hallucination, as we generally understand it, is a form of uncontrolled perception, then normal perception, here and now, is also a hallucination, but a controlled one, where the brain's predictions are continually refined by data.
What about the fact that the brain itself is an experience for a neuroscientist?
Absolutely.
Looking? So, is the brain a controlled hallucination itself? I
think our experience of it is, yes. I mean, there's some terrific examples in the history of science that underline this point. And if you think, I've never seen a neuron, right? I mean, I've seen brains, but I've never seen a neuron apart from through some representation, whether it's a microscope or something else. And so our conception of what's there is always dependent on the sorts of experiences we have. And back at the beginning of neuroscience in the late 19th and early 20th century, people still argued about whether there were separate brain cells called neurons or whether there was just a single interconnected network or reticulum.
Yeah.
So there's a big argument between Golgi on the one hand and Ramon y Cajal on the other. And it was an amazing story because Golgi developed all the methods in early microscopy that allowed people for the first time to visualize brain cells. But he was so fixed on his prior belief that there was a single undifferentiated network that's what he continued to believe, even though the evidence that he provided the tools to reveal showed differently. And Ramon y Cajal, even though he didn't develop these techniques, he saw more clearly what was really there, or what was a better approximation anyway. So he identified the fact that neurons are indeed separate cells. But this, I think, just goes to show that there were two very different experiences of what a brain consists in. And the development of the scientific method allowed these views to be refined. And there's no ground truth to this. I mean, still the idea that the brain is a collection of separate neurons that now form a neural network, that's neglecting a whole bunch of other stuff that's happening in brains. But yes, I think brains are objects and exist in as much as any other object exists. And our experience of them is constructed in the same way, but that's the beauty of science, right? It allows us to look further and deeper.
So when we were corresponding, you added something in our notes, which I have here, is the individual identity also similarly a controlled hallucination?
Yeah. And here I think it is, and I think this is something that I still struggle to think about a lot.
Two hallucinations speaking to each other.
Yeah, and we have a joint hallucination of this, a control, but it's controlled by... I mean, you guys out there, I can't see you, so you're even more of a less controlled hallucination. But certainly, it's one thing to argue that the experience of colour is something that the brain generates. In a way, we've known that since Newton, who showed how you could make up colours from light waves and so on. Colour is something the brain generates.
But where is colour?
As we get back to the first question you asked,
Yeah.
I mean, not sure it's a question that has an answer.
Okay.
But certainly I think the principles of perception being a product of a prediction and sensory data apply just as much to ourselves as to the world. And again, some simple studies get at this a little bit. Like we tend to think, this is my body, these are my hand, that's my hand, it's my left hand. And how could I experience that differently? It just seems to be given to me that part of the world is my body, and that's part of the experience of being me. But some very simple experiments with things like the rubber hand illusion, where you can give a fake hand and you give the right kind of sensory input and the person hides it. So what happens is the person hides their real hand under a table, you put a fake hand on top, the experimenter then strokes the two hands together.
Yeah, Ramachandran.
Yeah, it's back to well, it was Botvinnik and... but anyway, same stuff with the phantom net.
Speaking to Ramachandran a lot.
But that shows that it's very easy to change just our perception of what our body is. And okay, then you can say, well, that's not really who I am, that's just what is my hand and where is my hand. But the contention is you just follow that thought all the way down the rabbit hole. It applies, I think, to everything that we associate with the experience of being a self. And I think this is very aligned with some of the Eastern teachings about self.
To the Eastern...
there is no such thing as a self that is an indivisible thing. I mean,
as an ego identity.
Yeah, there is the experience of selfhood, but that doesn't have any privileged ontological status, I don't think. And so here I see a really interesting way of bringing together the phenomenological, by which I mean it's about experience. These traditions that have thought in a very different and very rich way about what experience is like, and the Western scientific tradition which can begin to get at the mechanisms.
Wittgenstein, the German philosopher, said our life is a dream. We are asleep, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming.
Yeah.
Which is very similar to what the Buddha said. He said, this lifetime of ours is transient as autumn clouds.
Yeah.
To watch the birth and death of beings is like looking at the movements of a dance. A lifetime is like a flash of lightning in the sky, rushing by like a torrent down a steep mountain. So, given all these different disparate views of what is reality, and I'm getting there very fast, what is the ontological primitive of reality?
Now you're getting there really fast, and here
I was planning to go over all the theories,
fine, but we can jump in there for a minute. But yeah, I remember reading something recently that if you think about consciousness long enough, you start off as a dualist, so somebody who thinks that mind is separate from body or matter, like Descartes originally, and then you might become a materialist, that you think, no, it's the brain produces consciousness somehow by means as yet unknown. Then you become a panpsychist, that consciousness is everywhere in the universe and it has maybe the same status as things like mass, energy, charge. And finally you become an idealist. That
I think you go even beyond idealist, you become a non-dualist, because idealism is still mind, right? Non-dualism it's all one.
Maybe you help me understand the difference, but I certainly think what I understand by idealism, yes, the fundamental ontology of the universe is mind stuff, mental stuff, res cogitans, and the problem isn't how mind comes from matter. It's what is matter, and
matter is as elusive as mind.
Yeah,
right?
and I think
in a sense matter is
right.
The nature. First of all, atomic matter is only 4% of the universe, and most of it is invisible interstellar dust. The visible universe, we are now told 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable trillions of planets, is 0.01%. That's atomic, and the atoms themselves, soon, if you go looking at them, they disappear into probability waves in mathematical imagination.
I mean, it's completely mind-boggling, and I'll be the first to admit that certainly I don't know what matter is, and I don't think I'm pretty sure nobody does, and I've been recently reading from a naive point of view, because I'm not a theoretical physicist, but the debates that are ongoing in theoretical physics and quantum mechanics and quantum gravity about what really is the universe made of is still very much up for grabs, and just seeing how this conception changes over history is fascinating. Even in the Western tradition, from Democritus thinking about atoms, I mean that's where we first had the idea of the atom, then to atoms, so atoms in the void, then to atoms in fields with Maxwell and Faraday, and then the fact that space and time, so you had atoms, fields and time, and then Einstein put fields and time together, and then we had quantum mechanics which says no, there's no such thing as separate atoms, are not separate from the space between them. It's just a fascinating evolution of what we understand at the deepest level as being there, and I certainly don't think that it's safe to make any final claims about this. So from that point of view, I mean it's much safer ground to say the only thing I can be sure of that exists is my experience. But other things exist in an empirically reasonable sense. If I kick a table, then my toe hurts, because whatever tables and my toe are ultimately made out of, it's the same thing.
The table is an experience in consciousness, the foot is an experience in consciousness, and the pain is an experience in consciousness.
Well, I think,
right?
Yes and no. I think my perception of the table is an experience in consciousness, my perception of my toe is an experience. But the table has a mode of existence made out of whatever the ultimate nature of reality is.
So now let's go a little deeper in that rabbit hole.
Okay,
You
we
said-
can try.
We can try. So you mentioned a baby. Do you have any kids?
I don't have any kids.
Okay, you
no.
married?
No.
Okay. So anyway, a baby has an experience, right?
Yeah.
But no constructs yet. For a baby, there's color, there's form, there's shape.
Well, we
presume.
We presume, and of
Yeah.
course, William James, one of the earliest psychologists, described the infinite experience as this blooming, buzzing confusion, where things maybe didn't resolve into forms and colours. But I certainly agree, I think, although it's very difficult to ask a newborn baby what they're perceiving something.
And then we introduce language,
Yeah.
right? And then language becomes a symbol of experience, right?
Right.
How we communicate. So this becomes a hand. This becomes a table. In ancient times, they would say earth, water, fire, air, space.
Yeah.
Today we say gluons, particles, force fields, electromagnetism, physical body,
Yeah.
atoms. Are all these just human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in consciousness? Are these real entities, or did we create them? I mean, is every description, scientific included, actually a symbolic representation of
I think
a mode of knowing and consciousness?
Yeah,
a
I think so, but maybe not linguistic. I mean, perhaps that's the beauty of mathematics, and there's a big mystery there about why mathematics has been so successful
I was going to ask
in
you that.
describing the world. But certainly, yes, I think all of these ideas about neurons down to atoms, down to gluons, down to whatever, however far down the rabbit hole you want to go, these are all concepts that humans have developed with some form of language or systematic thinking.
So is this a symbolic representation?
Well, I don't think it's a symbolic rep. I mean, symbolic has that particular connotation that
Is this
it's
a
formed of
construct?
symbols.
Is this a human construct? Is body, mind, universe, brain a human construct for modes of knowing and experience?
I don't think so, but I think our ways of describing it absolutely are, and we should never make the mistake of confounding our descriptions of things
Is
with
mind,
with reality.
brain, body, and the universe a unified experience?
So now I'm not sure. I'll have to be honest. I'm not sure how to answer that particular question, because I think, and maybe I'm going to agree with you about some aspects of this, that we tend to assume a separation between mind, body, and world, which we shouldn't.
I mean, all these people who are sending us messages.
Oh yeah.
And we're kind of giving them information, and their neurons are being triggered right now, just as a result of this conversation. If we said something nice to them, look, they're sending these hearts.
Yeah, I see they go as far as you. They don't ever come to me. I don't know why that is.
That's kind of, we're kind of in, is this an entangled mind right now that we're experiencing through cyberspace that affects everything from serotonin to dopamine to opiates to oxytocin to adrenaline to cortisol? Is this part of the ecosystem of mind?
There's certainly a social element to mind, right? I think.
I mean, you can send somebody an abusive remark and bring on inflammation.
Absolutely, yeah.
Whatever, right?
Yeah. So the social aspect, especially to human consciousness, is absolutely fundamental. I mean, part of my perception of who I am depends on how I perceive others as perceiving me. How do I think that you think about me now? How do I think that the people out there are perceiving me and you and us together? So the social aspect is critical. What the mechanisms are that mediate that, that's continually changing and up for grabs, isn't it? I mean, language is a very powerful way. When we're in the same space, we can have body language and facial expression, all these other powerful things. And of course, cyberspace brings a whole new dimension to that, where we can interact with
mind.
Yeah, sure. Our minds are expanded through the access.
My friend
to others.
Dan Siegel, who's a neuropsychiatrist at UCLA, his definition of mind is it's an embodied and relational process. Embodied and relational with all these guys too. Process that is regulating the flow of energy and information within the ecosystem of biological organisms.
Yeah, I agree with the first part of that. Certainly, that it's embodied and relational.
Well,
and then
I lift my hand. That's energy and information, right?
Well, these are very, very loaded terms that have many different meanings, right? Depends what you mean by information. Is another really good example of something that might enter into ontology of the universe in some way. So the great physicist John Wheeler was famous for his it from bit, and a lot of contemporary neuroscientific ideas about consciousness. I don't know if the viewers here will be familiar with Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, and that it's a really powerful theory. I like some parts of it. I don't like other parts of it.
Information not a derivative of consciousness?
Well, in that theory, I'm just sort of saying what they say. I mean, for that theory, information is fundamental. I mean, that's how they explain the existence of consciousness in the first place.
Human construct.
By saying that information exists and consciousness is a particular manifestation of information in this form of integrated information. And that's a really intriguing idea because information in science started out as a very, if you like, boring way of assessing whether you could transmit a signal without error. And it's evolved into this very interesting concept of uncertainty in general. And of course, the idea of uncertainty is at the heart of quantum physics too. It's one of the fundamental pillars there. So information may play a very important role in our understanding of the brain. But it's often misconstrued. I think you probably come across this as well. People often talk about the brain as doing information processing, as if it's a computer like this phone or the laptop. Information processing, and people say it as if it's obvious what they mean by information processing. What they usually mean is this old analogy that the brain is a computer and the mind is the software, which I think is really faulty.
I agree. So you mentioned John Wheeler. In one of his interviews, he did say that the universe at its source is immaterial.
Yeah. So he's probably reached that end point of becoming an idealist, that we described earlier. I mean, I have to, this is what it sort of feels like for me as a scientist in these things, that in a sense, I have to put aside some of these big metaphysical questions. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't think they're important. I don't think about them.
For practical science,
but for practical purposes, whether everything is in the mind, whether it's idealism, whether consciousness is everywhere, in panpsychism.
In non-dualism, by the way, the mind is also in consciousness. Consciousness is prior to mind. It's not Descartes' dualism.
Right.
Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, but in non-dualism, I am, therefore I think. I am precedes every experience.
Yeah.
And that, so in that non-dual philosophy, consciousness is the ontological primitive as the potential for experience, not experience, but the potential for experience. But anyway, coming back to practical things, because I was very interested in, you added this interoception, emotions, and homeostasis, which, by the way, is a very big interest of mine.
That's why I added it. I thought it might be something we
so let's talk about
Right.
interoception, homeostasis, and emotions.
Very briefly, so when we think about perception, again, the easy way to think about perception is our perception of the outside world. We have eyes, we have all these holes in our head through which sensory information arrives. And when most people talk about perception, they often even just talk about vision. It's amazing how often you just reduce all of perception to vision. But a great deal of perception is happening inside our bodies. So the inside of my body, what my heart is doing, how my gut is doing, just how my legs are doing, that's as inaccessible to the brain as the table in front of me knew. I mean, it's still all just electrical impulses coming into the brain in this view. So the brain has to make sense of these impulses in just the same way. What's called interoception is just the contrast to exteroception. Exteroception is perception of the outside world. Interoception is perception of the internal condition of the body. we know a great deal of the brain is devoted to this. Not surprising that it is, because if you think about what brains are for, they're for keeping the body alive.
Homeostasis.
And there we get to homeostasis. So and here's the interesting difference, I think, between exteroception and interoception. When we perceive the outside world, what often we're doing is trying to figure out what's there. Because we need to figure out what's there before we know how to act in order to best preserve homeostasis. So is that a bear? I should run away. Is that some food? I should pick it up and eat it. So we need to know what's there first. Interoception isn't really like that. I don't need to know where my heart is or where my guts actually are, or where
unless something is wrong.
Unless something is wrong. So interoception is much more directly about control and regulation. We perceive in order to control. And there's a lovely line of thinking that comes into this, that there's some old ideas from engineering that in order to effectively regulate something, whether it's the temperature in your house or the amount of fuel going into your car engine, you have to be able to predict the consequences of disturbances. And this is especially key for the body. You don't want to wait until your heart stops in order to prevent it from stopping. It's too late. We do this all the time. Whenever you stand up from a chair, the brain is implementing all these predictive changes in your blood pressure so that you don't faint as soon as you stand up. And so interoception is serving a different kind of purpose, but it's using the same principles. It's still using prediction, but in this case to control rather than to figure out. And that's why I think experiences of emotion, of mood, and of what you might call the most basic experience of all, which is the experience of I am, of being a body, of being alive, I think have their origin in this process of predictive control of the body. And I like this because it emphasizes again the strong connection between being alive and being conscious, rather than being smart or being linguistic and so on.
So, in my particular area of interest being yoga meditation, interoception is called pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses from the outside world and directing awareness into the body.
Yes.
And even influencing it, like you can influence vagal tone through breathing.
Yes.
Through various yoga postures, you can influence vagal tone. That influences heart rate variability, that influences ultimately even microbial activity in the gut.
Yes.
It's all part of one wholeness, outside, inside, all in this ontological primitive, for lack of a better word, awareness. I don't know what else to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree that there is. It's not just one-way traffic, right? And meditation is a wonderful example. I've only dabbled in meditation, which is not what you're supposed to do. It doesn't really do much good. But I spent a lot of time with maybe more people from the Buddhist tradition who.
Yeah, we've been
meditators.
looking at things like telomerase, neural networks, how they change with meditation, all this new stuff on neuroplasticity.
Do you know Tanya Singer's group in Leipzig who are doing some fantastic work, I think.
Yeah. So let's, as we go towards the end of our conversation, let's talk a little bit about the future. I just came from Dubai, where I met the first cyborg. He's from Britain, a young man.
Oh, I know. I think I know who you mean.
There's two antennas sticking out. So he was born colorblind.
Yes.
And he decided to turn the electromagnetic spectrum into the experience of sound.
Yeah.
And so he hears colors.
Yeah.
And then he went further. By the way, he had a difficulty getting a passport because there's no provision for a cyborg. But he finally went to court and he got it from the British government.
Right.
But now he's gone further. He can access the experience of infrared or ultraviolet. So I asked him, I said, a snake experiences infrared, and there are bees, honeybees that navigate experience through ultraviolet.
Yeah.
Are you having their experiences? He says, no, I don't have their consciousness.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm creating new experiences.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating to me. But, right now at this conference, by the way, we are at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson. There are a lot of people here working with augmented reality, artificial intelligence, VR, etc. In my area, coming to treatment of people with sickness, I see this as a great future to even all change our neural networks. Because, if I have an autistic child and he's looking at a VR or augmented version of himself that has normal facial expressions emotionally, there's a possibility that might rewire neural networks. When I was in medical school, long time ago, before you were born.
Probably not.
Long time ago, before you were born, I read this experiment that I think those guys got the Nobel Prize, Hubel and Weasel. They took kittens and they brought them up in a room that either had horizontal stripes or vertical stripes.
It wasn't Hubel and Weasel, but I struggling the name. I know exactly what you mean. It's that. That
so
carousel.
They ended up perceiving only horizontal world or vertical world based on their initial experience.
That's right.
So our initial experiences as we are growing up actually ultimately determine how we perceive reality.
It's I think I agree with pretty much all of that, and there's so much evidence now, and in a way it's common sense, but the richness of the environment that you develop in just has a huge impact, not just in what you think and what your personality might be like, but literally how you perceive things. And certainly during early stages of development, that's when the brain's wiring is probably changing the most. That's when we develop the capacity to have different kinds of experiences. Of course, there's always been a lot of interest in people who have been maybe deaf from birth or blind from birth, and then you can somehow restore the sensory inputs. You can provide a cochlear implant, or you can remove a cataract that might have been there from birth. But they will have great difficulty interpreting. And I think this gets back to, makes sense in terms of the view that I've been trying to explain, which is that the sensory data is just one part of it. Our brains are imposing these very, very subtle, implicit but rich interpretations on that sensory data. And unless you've had the environment to develop those interpretations, what you will experience will not be the same. And back to the cyborg. Yes, I agree with him. His experience is not the same as a snake because he's just given himself the same sensory input, but not the same mechanism of interpretation. So, back to Nagel, where we started, I suppose, his other famous contribution was, what is it like to be a bat? We will never know because we are not bats.
What's the future for you? Where's your research going?
It's what we continue to try to do is really advance this idea, I think, of understanding conscious perception as prediction, and that opens up a lot of empirical avenues, because not all of the things that the brain predicts or senses are reflected in our conscious experience. So we can use these ideas to just do experiments, brain imaging experiments and the like, to try to find out a bit more about, in humans, what is the relation between sensory data, brain structure, and conscious experience.
Who or what is it that wants to know?
I want to know, but then who am I? I can't, I can do what I want, but I can't will what I want. That's the way I'm built. I happen to think that I'm not alone, and of course I'm not alone. You think, you've been fascinated in this area for a long time too, and people are. It's one of the eternal questions. We always wonder who we are and what our place in the universe is, and what the relation is between our consciousness, our mind, our body, the world, the wider universe. These questions are not going to go away, right? And I don't think, I'm not going to find an answer. I don't think anybody at this conference is going to find the answer. But the other side of the coin is that the process of doing so, I think, will have a lot of more immediate implications, both, as you said, for technology. So we're changing our experiences so rapidly now. We're interacting with social media, with cell phones, with various ways of augmenting and the things that we can sense and conceive just in their nature, but over time, over space as well. that's something we need to understand the implications of this. And then there's the implications for the clinical domain as well. And there's stuff with VR and autism. I don't know about autism, but certainly in schizophrenia and some other conditions, this is work that's already being done, and I think it's really very powerful.
Inflammation too.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a very enjoyable conversation, Anil, and look out for him. He's a rising star. So check out Anil Seth's website. It's right here. And check out his TED Talk as well. And stay in touch. And it was a great privilege to have you and learn
likewise.
from you. And hopefully we'll do it again.
I very much enjoyed that. Yeah. It's been a great pleasure to you, Deepak. And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you. And we'll see you again.
Bye.